Good morning from London. My name is Crispin Blunt. I am the Member of Parliament for Reigate in the British House of Commons. And this is a detention review panel with two of my esteemed parliamentary colleagues, Layla Moran, from the Liberal Democratic Party, of where she is the Foreign Affairs spokesman, and Imran Ahmed Khan, who was elected as a new Member of Parliament for Wakefield in 2019. But both my colleagues are uniquely qualified in their experience in the area. Imran Khan with a distinguished career working in some of the more interesting areas of the Middle East and working with the Foreign Office and other related areas. And so I hope our authority, as independent-minded panelists who have a significant interest in the success of the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom, and my own record in particular as chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee between 2015 and 2017, and indeed my time as Prisons Minister when I began a program of investment in the justice system in Saudi Arabia, which was sadly ended by one of my previous colleagues, has given me a particular interest in this area. However, we have worked very hard in gathering evidence from around the world and invited evidence to be submitted to us around the direct issue of the imprisonment of former Crown Prince Muhammed bin Nayef and Prince Ahmed bin Abdu-Aziz. But of course, the wider context of imprisonment of political detainees is the context in which these most senior of the political detainees is of interest to everyone, because if their conditions are extremely difficult, what might that mean for everyone else? But it's an if, and we are seeking evidence and have I now want to announce the beginning of this, that our evidence, formal evidence taking and receiving emissions, does have to have a end date, and that will be the 23rd of November. And what I would now like to do is to invite our first witness, Adam Kugel of Human Rights Watch, to begin setting out the scene for us in about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you everyone for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm just going to use my time to give a general overview of the situation and maybe nail down and talk more specifically about issues regarding the former Crown Prince Muhammed bin Nayef and others towards the end. So I think, first of all, to speak a little bit about the former Crown Prince Muhammed bin Nayef in this manner, I think if you had told me that this would happen about 6-7 years ago, I would have been pretty surprised. For those who don't know, he served as the Interior Minister from 2012 to 2017, and frankly was responsible for the arrest and prosecution of many of the members of the human rights community in Saudi Arabia. And the fact that he went from being the perpetrator to then being the victim, I think has some lessons for everyone about the nature of political repression. Number one, that it doesn't always work, that people, you can't necessarily snuff out people's ambitions for freedom and a better life simply by arresting and trying to, engage in repression. But the other lesson is, you can be on the other side of it, right? If the country lacks strong institutions and the rule of law, if the administration of justice is not objective, then you, as much as anyone else, might be the victim of that repression, if you fall on the wrong side of things politically. So I think it's important just to say that, right at the outset. So I think, given that MBN, was the Interior Minister and did arrest and prosecute many members of the opposition and human rights community, I think it should be put into perspective that what came after him when Mohammed bin Salman ousted him and became Crown Prince was of many categories worse than anything we had seen. In fact, the previous 3 years since Mohammed bin Salman became the crown prince and the de facto ruler of the country, has really been the worst period of repression of civil and political rights in modern Saudi history, both in terms of the number of arrests and the kinds of the introduction of arbitrary repressive practices that we've seen over the past couple of years. So when Mohammed bin Salman became the crown prince in the middle of 2017, this wasn't done sort of in a vacuum. It was done, by sort of reorganizing the state levers of repression, by centralizing power, and by ousting other officials that could potentially serve as checks on his power. The most important, of course, was the former crown prince Muhammad bin Nayef, who he moved against first by removing the prosecution service from Mohammed bin Nayef, one of the chief levers of Saudi repression, taking it over, establishing a new agency, the public prosecution, that was directly under the royal court instead. And then after he ousted Mohammed bin Nayef, he immediately reorganized the entire security service, taking many of the counterterrorism and frankly, levers of repression from the Ministry of Interior, establishing a new agency, the Presidency of State Security, and placing all of those new powers under the State Security Presidency, which was only loyal to him. He then ousted heads of other agencies such as the Ministry of National Guard and others, and put his cronies. In fact, the new Interior Minister he installed, who remains until now, was a close relative who was in his early 30s and had very little experience to be running such an important and large ministry. But that just shows how important it was that he put his people and his cronies in those positions. As soon as he got the levers of power and reorganized the state security apparatus, he immediately launched waves and waves of arrests and repression, starting in September of 2017 when he arrested prominent clerics, including Sheikh Salman al-Auda, our panelist Abdullah al-Auda's father, as well as other prominent clerics who were independent, who dared to speak up and criticize Saudi authorities. They were accompanied by the arrest of hundreds of others, academics, intellectuals, human rights activists. Then in November, 2 months later, Mohammed bin Salman launched the infamous Ritz Carlton arrests against the prominent business people, as well as former government officials and royal family members, accused them of corruption, which appeared to be really highly politicized charges for which there was no real due process, and merely sought to sideline them or shake them down for their assets, which we saw later. And then, of course, later in early 2018, we saw the really horrible arrest of the women's rights activists who were detained beginning in May and through July, and really, I think, captured a lot of people's attention, just given the way in which those women had been the front lines of reform on women's rights in Saudi Arabia, and were suddenly in jail. In describing the repression under Mohammed bin Salman, it's important to note it's not just the sheer numbers of people who have been arrested. It's also some of the abusive and arbitrary practices that have been introduced into the system. I think probably everybody knows the most egregious case, which was the assassination of Saudi journalist Khashoggi in Istanbul in late 2018, and also the allegation from Mohammed bin Nayef's former security official Saad Jebri that the same hit team actually targeted him in Canada right after that, which is the subject of a lawsuit in US district courts right now. Those practices are well known, but perhaps maybe a little bit less well known are some of the others, which were the detention of individuals and the detention of individuals at unofficial places of detention, which we saw with the Ritz-Carlton arrests, but actually, and more problematically for me, the detention of women's rights activists at unofficial places of detention, where allegations of torture and mistreatment were rampant. Women who were detained at these locations have alleged that they were beaten, that they were electrocuted, that they were sexually abused and maybe even sexually assaulted. I think we'll hear more from Lujena Hadlou's sister about some of these allegations in the panelists to come, more specifically. But it wasn't just the women's rights activists. Many detainees at the Ritz Carlton also alleged that they were tortured and mistreated to hand over their assets. And while torture is always something we have seen in Saudi Arabia, and it's been a problem, I think just the brazen nature of doing this and doing it in unofficial detention centers was beyond anything we've actually seen before in Saudi Arabia. Beyond torture and detention practices, we also have the practice of this just long-term arbitrary detention. People held in detention for years and years and years with absolutely no charges, no legal process whatsoever. And there's people that were detained in 2017 that still haven't been charged, right? And the basis of their detention is completely illegal, yet it persists. And the other, I think, important aspect I wanted to point to is Saudi Arabia's increasing use of advanced surveillance technology to go after and target dissidents both inside Saudi Arabia and abroad. And in addition to the surveillance technology, we of course have the allegations that they directly infiltrated the Twitter and were able, through that infiltration, to unmask certain Twitter users who had been tweeting criticism anonymously. So, from the repressive, the introduction of these new repressive techniques plus the surveillance, I think it's clear from that the repression we've seen is really of a category beyond anything we saw previous to that. So these conditions have remained. We've seen more arrest waves. We saw 2 different arrest waves in 2019. And then of course, earlier in 2020, we saw the rearrest of former Crown Prince Muhammed bin Nayef, as well as his uncle, Prince Ahmed bin Abdu-Aziz. And while the details surrounding those arrests are quite opaque and unclear, it does appear, both via Saudi government official statements as well as rumors through the Saudi troll apparatus on social media, that they are accused of either fomenting a coup against Mohammed bin Salman or of massive corruption. Now, I think it's important to take all of those allegations with a total grain of salt, given the fact that these trials and the due process we've seen for other individuals accused of this kind of activity, the due process has been absolutely nil. People have not been able to adequately defend themselves. They have not actually been put through court processes to determine innocence or guilt, and whatever court processes we have seen have been fundamentally unfair. Those 2 have remained in detention. The conditions that they are experiencing are a little bit unclear. Mohammed bin Nayef's lawyers in London have put out limited information stating that his current place of detention is completely unknown. They don't know where he is, and that his communication with the outside world has been severely circumscribed and limited post his detention in March. And the small contacts he has had really have been more geared towards trying to pressure his family to produce evidence that potentially could be used against him.
Adam, can I just interrupt you there, because we're quite tight for time for the number of people who wanted to give us evidence, and there's even more pressure on Layla Moran, as she is the shadow foreign affairs spokesman for the Liberal Democrats. So it can't join us for the final Q&A session when all of you, apart from one of our witnesses who has a slightly longer session, so we will question her while she's with us. But I now want to just ask Layla to finish off each of the witness sessions with questions that she's got, so that she's able to get her questions in. And I ought to say to those people who are watching, of course, we are getting, you've all submitted significant written evidence as well, and that will obviously is the evidence in chief. And we have sought evidence on the wider Saudi position from positions that might paint a more sympathetic context for the description that we've just heard from Adam. But Layla, if I can just ask you to put whatever questions you have to Adam. We've only got about a couple of minutes, I'm afraid, and that will be the case for for each session, but we are going to be able to come back to our witnesses in writing if we need to.
Well, thank you so much, Crispin, and thank you all for being here today. Adam, thank you for that whip round précis in 10 minutes. Well done to a very complex issue. I suppose my first question and main question is, we are very much putting across to the Saudi Arabian government that this is an opportunity to come back politically in the eyes of the world from the disaster that was the assassination of Khashoggi. And I am a bit concerned that they haven't engaged with us publicly, although privately we have had some engagement, which is advancement on where we were when we did the panel, when we looked at the female activists, when was it, 18 months ago or so. In your eyes, Adam, where does Saudi Arabia now sit? Do you sense this feeling that we've heard that they do want to do better over the last 18 months? Have you seen other evidence of this? And then as a second question, if you could answer it at the same time, our panel is very much considering the detention of the prince's members of the royal family as a proxy for the wider detention conditions of other political activists and organisers as well. Is that a fair comparison to make? By looking at these two individuals, could we infer the regime that the other prisoners may be under, or is that something that we should be keeping separate? Thank you.
Just to answer the last question first, I think it's a little bit complicated just because we know so little about the detentions of Muhammad bin Nayef and Prince Ahmed. We don't know where they are. We don't know their specific conditions. But that being said, I think at the same time, those conditions prevail for many other detainees too, who are not royal family members. And the lack of transparency and the inability of many of these detainees, including Abdullah's father, Sheikh Salman, to contact the outside world and explain what their conditions are, I think is reflective of the broader situation. So while it's possible, and certainly some royal family members were held not initially in detention centers, but in palaces and things like that. So it's possible that some of their detention conditions are different, but some of the other conditions and the lack of access to the outside world, lack of access to lawyers, and profoundly unfair trials and lack of due process, I think are probably pretty similar and would stand as a proxy for the other cases. In terms of where Saudi Arabia stands right now, it's a little bit hard to say. My inclination is that the comments by the Saudi ambassador to London last week, in which he indicated that there were discussions about potentially releasing prominent women's rights activist Loujain al-Havloul, they were quickly walked back once they generated big news. But I think the idea that he admitted those conversations were going on and that Saudi authorities were cognizant of the fact that this was causing a lot of bad reputational damage, I think are clear evidence that there at least is some pressure on the authorities to stop the crackdown and to do something about this. My concern is we're going to get a couple of symbolic releases, but none of the fundamental practices will change. So that's I think something to be concerned about. But I think that there is pressure. I think that Saudi Arabia's hosting of the G20, which is about to happen, as well as pouring so much money into these kind of massive PR events like F1, massive concerts. I think they are certainly an attempt by Saudi authorities to derive their reputational improvement benefits without actually making fundamental human rights reforms. And I think it's on us as the human rights community and things like this, the panel, to set the record straight and not let them get away with it.
Okay, Adam, thank you very much indeed. We'll return to these issues, no doubt, in the wider opportunity for further questions. I would now like to ask our second witness, Abdullah Al-Aoud of Dawn, to briefly speak to us for just under 10 minutes and allow a question from Leila Moran during your 10-minute session. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Crispin, and thank you for inviting me for this panel. Well, first of all, I am pleased to assist you on your mission by providing information about the following matters: the arrest, detention, and treatment of individuals in Saudi Arabia, and the prison conditions. Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAN, is a non-profit organization that promotes democracy, the rule of law, and human rights for all the peoples of the Middle East and North Africa. And as part of our work, we research, document, and publish information about human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, including the arrest, detention, and prosecution of human rights activists, political dissidents, and royals and business people. We also document their treatment in prison. Since the anointing of King Salman in Saudi Arabia in 2015 by a small royal cabal, the country has seen a dramatic and unprecedented concentration of power in the hands of his son, Crown Prince Muhammed bin Salman, or MBS, as he has been known. So MBS has exercised his power to conduct wide scale of arrest against those perceived to have independent power centers in the country, including the country's intellectuals, independent religious leadership, the business and media establishment, royal rivals, civil society reformists, including, of course, my father, Salman al-Auda, who has been really vocal for decades and has been really one of the most important Islamic scholars in the kingdom. And MBS, since ascending to power, has kidnapped in some cases and killed activists, including Jamal Khashoggi, and of course harassed and arrested royal family members, and kidnapped royal family members and some others abroad, including, for example, Nayef bin Talal al-Rashid, who was kidnapped from Kuwait, another prince was kidnapped from another country, Lujain al-Hadlul was kidnapped from Abu Dhabi, her ex-husband was kidnapped from Amman, Jordan. So it has been really a continuous practice, and maybe Ali Al-Hudul, who is a co-panelist here, can attest to her sister's case and the two kidnapping from Amman and Abu Dhabi, of both Fahad and Lujain. MBS also has held hostage foreign government leaders, including Lebanese Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri, and nominal Yemeni President Abdurabbu Mansour Hadi, and jailed family members of political exiles. Saudi Arabia's law prohibits freedom of association, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. Non-Muslim places of worship are prohibited, and I speak here as an expert and a legal and lawyer in Saudi Arabia. There are no independent civil society organizations in the country. The country is ruled as an absolute monarchy with no constitution or legal protections for the rights of the citizens. Reform in 2018 and 2019 allowed women the right to drive and ended certain aspects of the male guardianship system. But at the same time, those who have long campaigned for these changes languish in prison and have faced sexual harassment, torture, electrocution, and imprisonment by the government. And I think Ali Al-Hudul will speak further about this. Further, women still need to obtain a male guardian's permission to marry or even to have a medical operation in hospital. And husbands can continue to bar their wives from working under religious laws requiring a wife's obedience. Women also face a discrimination in divorce and inheritance. In the last 5 years, the Saudi authorities have engaged in an unprecedented crackdown on free speech and dissent, targeting activists and critics through intimidation, harassment, arrest, detention, torture, and extrajudicial killing. Those targeted include journalists, women rights activists, independent clerks, those who were engaging in peaceful speech and activity, which are protected by international human rights law. Saudi Arabia has no comprehensive penal code, but rather prosecutes people based on general and vague principles that are not codified. The authorities claim that these principles are based on Islamic law and jurisprudence, and they convict individuals based on vague charges like, for example, disturbing the peace, swaying public opinion, and inciting against the state. And all these three charges are part of the charges against my father, for example, Salman al-Auda. In addition, the authorities have enacted specific penal provisions, such as the Counterterrorism Law and the Anti-Cybercrime Law. Both laws enable abuse of power and allow government to prosecute peaceful activists and political detainees, in part because they include vague and overbroad definitions of crimes and criminalize peaceful speech and activity that are protected by international human rights law. For example, Article 6 and 13 of the Anti-Cybercrime Law prohibit preparing, producing, or publishing any material that threatens what they call the public order, religious values, public morals, and privacy. Article 1A of the Counterterrorism Law defines the crime of terrorism to include acts that disturb public order and endanger national unity. The Counterterrorism Law explicitly denies detainees and defendants the protections of Saudi Arabia's law of criminal procedure, which otherwise limits pre-trial detention to 6 months. Article 5 of the Counterterrorism Law allows for indefinite pre-trial detention at the discretion of the prosecutor. Therefore, there is a wide range of cases which defendants can languish in prison for years, such as the cases of my father, Salman al-Auda, who has been jailed for 3 years now, pending the outcome of his trial. And Lujain al-Hudlul, whose ongoing trial has been on hold without holding court sessions for more than 19 months now, even as she remains in jail. Since July 2017...
Abdullah, if we just bring your opening remarks to a close.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. Since 2017, the Saudi government has escalated its crackdown on dissenters by targeting their own family members inside and outside Saudi Arabia, like in the cases of Al-Jabri and Umar Abdu-Aziz. The Saudi authorities also banned 19 members of my family from travel just because they are relatives. The general conditions in Saudi Arabia in prisons are really poor, and many medical cases can attest
much of this, of course, I realize that 10 minutes is a very short time to make a presentation. And obviously sitting behind that is your written presentation, which we're taking obviously as evidence for the inquiry. But now just let me ask Leila if she has any questions for you before we move on to Alia Al-Husol.
Thank you, Crispin. Thank you, Abdullah, and thank you for that. It's a very stupid question I have, actually, but I think it's going to help those watching, and certainly me, who doesn't have the same depth of knowledge as you, to put this into context. In England, if you get arrested, there are basic rights that you can assume you have, and as you say, access to lawyers and access to medical intervention if you need it. Is there any such minimum standard that currently is meant to exist in Saudi Arabia that is not being met? Or is it that it just simply doesn't exist at all?
I would say it doesn't exist at all. There is, for example, the criminal procedures law, which would say that basic rights are protected, and it may have the minimum, but the problem with it is that they also enacted laws that can allow indefinite, for example, pre-trial detention, that can prosecute you for any crime, including, for example, being part of this panel as an act of terrorism, that can define any public dissent or public opinion, or even a tweet as part of, conspiring against the state. And they can simply define any public, not just dissent, public opinion as part of conspiring against the state, and therefore you lose any basic rights, and you lose even that minimum.
And as a quick follow-up, would you say there is broad support for this fairly loose set of definitions by the wider Saudi Arabian population?
Is there support by the wide population?
Yeah. Or do people whisper that, oh my God, this is terrible, but let's not talk about it? Or actually, broadly, are they like, they need to do what they need to do? Like, where would you say is the beating heart of the wider population right now?
Well, if you ask the Saudi government, they will give you a different answer than what I would give you. But they always claim that they have popularity. MBS is a young man who has been supported by many young people. But also to show you that this is all false and not accurate is to know that public opinion and surveys, polls are all banned in the kingdom. And I know a friend who even tried himself to conduct a poll, and he was banned. Some of his colleagues were arrested just because they were trying to do so. So they ban public opinion for a reason, because they know such arrest, prosecution, and persecution is not popular.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for the first session, Abdullah, and we hope we'll return to you for questions later in the session. It's now my very great pleasure to turn to Alia Al-Hasul, and particularly in light of the work the previous panel did, on which Layla Moran and I sat in February 2019, obviously in the very highly charged circumstances following the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And there was great focus on the fate of those women rights activists. Now, the situation for some of them, since we conducted our inquiry when all of those we were inquiring, or 8 were in detention, has improved to some degree, but it does not appear to have improved in terms of her detention for Lujain Al-Hasul. So I would now welcome the opportunity for her sister to speak to us. She's not going to be able to stay for the later Q&A session, so we've got a 15-minute session here, and we will then move into questions when she has finished her opening remarks. Alia, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about my sister. So first of all, my name is Alia. I'm the oldest sister of jailed Saudi activist Lujain Al-Hasul. Lujain was one of the leaders of the Women to Drive campaign. She was also campaigning to end the male guardianship system. As you know, this law used to consider Saudi women minors till the end of their lives. Before getting arrested, Lujain was in the process of setting up a shelter for women activists for domestic abuse. Indeed, she was first arrested first time in 2014 for advocating for women's rights. And in that jail, which called Rehabilitation Center, she met extraordinary women, but who do not have supportive family. So they end up in those rehabilitation center, which is a jail. So their crime was only being women, women who were victim of a violent male guardian. Today, I would like to highlight the double talks by Saudi authorities. In one hand, Saudi authorities are doing massive PR campaign, and you might see it. They are showing a new, very stylish image of Saudi Arabia that does not reflect truly the reality. And on the other hand, as Abdullah said, the Saudi Arabia has completely stopped engaging with its own people. There is no discussion, everything is monitored. So back to Lujain. Lujain is very popular. She loves talking to people and tries to help them personally. She spent her time trying to help people here and there. So Lujain, who fought for the rights for her people, was kidnapped. And you heard this word a lot in all the testimonies, because indeed she was kidnapped in the highway in Abu Dhabi. She was kidnapped, she was alone in the car. So maybe they did it on purpose in order that no one witnessed that kidnapping. And she was sent to Saudi Arabia. There in Saudi Arabia, she was tortured for months. we hear the word torture and we forget to know what really means. And when it took months before she admitting that she was tortured, because she was so scared. And when she started talking about the torture, every time she speaks, she said that I thought I was going to die. And it's very, we are so used to the word torture, so we forget to understand how painful this was for her. Maybe people that are asking why she was arrested. So in fact, it took 10 months before that she knows, and we know why she was arrested. She was communicated the charges in a trial, and it was in 2019, and the charges were very vague, not to say absurd. And the trial is on and off. It's still unclear what is the status of this trial. And it shows that the court is not that independent, because the judge seemed to be waiting for orders. And this is what everyone witnessed in the court. So they cannot answer you directly. They are sending people and they are receiving orders. What is unfortunate today is that Lujain has started a hunger strike on October 28th, so a couple of weeks ago. She's demanding regular contact with her family. Since that, we do not know anything about her health condition, and it is so frightening for us because we can think that the worst that can happen to her. And back to the situation in Saudi Arabia, I say it is a very stylish PR campaign. So what I would like to say that is openness and modernization are a collective construction where all factions of the society need to be involved and not jailed, which is what Lujain and the other people tried to do for Saudi Arabia, to make it more open, more modern. And they were all involved in this process, but unfortunately they were jailed for that. So what is important to know regarding Lujain is that during these 2 years, no Saudi institution responds to us. Whether it's to know where Lujain is, for example, when she was in a mysterious prison, or regarding the torture. Saudi officials only, and this is really unfortunate for us, only engage with foreign officials and journalists. Crown Prince, for example, said in an interview in 2018 with Bloomberg that my sister and her co-activists were spies, foreign agents, and he had videos of that, and he could show it after the interview to the journalist of Bloomberg. It has been 2 years and nothing has been given. And Lujain is still arbitrarily detained. Again, Crown Prince Muhammed also said in 2019 to CNN and never to the Saudi media that if the torture was true, he would personally follow up on that. You can imagine no investigation has taken place regarding Lujain's torture, and no independent party is allowed to visit her. We asked for that, but it was not conclusive. During these 2 years, more than 2 years, Saudi Arabia refused to engage honestly regarding human rights. It has only tried to whitewash its image by creating non-independent commission, such as the Human Rights Commission. There's a true wall between the regime and the Saudi people. Not only Saudi citizens, but also residents inside of Saudi Arabia cannot safely speak and continue to be subject to human rights violation. And this is why the G20
we want to ask you
this year,
questions as well. I know you have to leave. I know you have to leave early, so I'm hoping we can have a little time for questions. So if you can just bring your remarks in chief to a conclusion, so we can have 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah. So I'm concluding here is we have G20 today that is organized in Saudi Arabia. So for me, this year should be the G20 should be a platform of honest discussion and not a way to legitimize the Saudi regime. So for me, people engaging in the G20, they can make pressure, and we can see that pressure works really for Saudi government. Thank you.
I thank you very much indeed, and obviously appreciate hugely a family member coming to give evidence to us. And obviously, it reflects the work we did in 2019. Now, for many of the detainees we examined there, they have been released, and their conditions have been improved so far as we understand. If you know of the evidence around the others that would contradict that, please do tell us. And you gave a line saying, "We know why she was arrested." Why was she arrested, in your view?
So there is a trial, and she received a list of charges, the charges. And if you read the charges, it was advocating for human rights, advocating for women campaign to drive, advocating to end up the guardian system, male guardianship, and also something related to her application for a job at the United Nations. So you see, there is no concrete crime.
How did that differentiate her from the other female detainees we inquired into?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, most of them have almost a copy-paste charges, except for some slight different. For example, Lujan, she applied for the United Nations; it was included in her charges. But for example, all of them, they have the charges for advocating for women's rights, for ending up a system guardianship. There's no real reflection on their situation. It is just to silence people up. So
the point that has been repeated to the panel members and reading around this is that she alone appears to be on the receiving end of an allegation of being an agent of a foreign state. Could there be some basis of misunderstanding around that as to where she might have received money for the supporting of her democracy causes from a place that might be misinterpreted? What do you think is the position as to why she's being treated differently in that respect, and the rhetoric around her, as you explained, used by the Crown Prince abroad? Why is it different in her case than with the others?
I think there are two things. First, I think she's not treated differently. She's treated as the others. It's just because her family, her siblings, me and my sister and my brother, we are speaking up, so which is unusual sometimes, especially when it's related to women's rights. And especially my brother, he's a male defending a woman, which is not really very common in Saudi Arabia. So this one, and this is a first part. And when you say she's treating differently, all women, even those who were released, their condition is not great, and either they are called every time to the court to witness, and their business were stopped. So I mean, I think we do not really, and they are scared to speak up, so we do not really know their conditions, and it is really premature to say that their condition is improved. Regarding spies, being a spy, in the charges we received, we didn't see any word of spy, being a spy or an agent for a foreign country. Regarding money, receiving money, there is only one charge saying that she was on a trip for a conference, and she received $50 per day as a compensation for the trip. The trip, I think, or the conference, it lasts for less than 4 days. So if you can say 50 times 4, it is the money that is accused of being receiving a money to change the country. I mean, it is ridiculous.
Yeah, before inviting my two panel colleagues, if they have any questions to you before you have to go, Alia, if there is any further evidence, available to you about her condition and else from the family, do please let us know. It obviously remains of particular interest to Leila and I, having investigated her and the other activists just under 2 years ago. But also that I would particularly like in that evidence, I'm not asking you to do it now, there has been some suggestion that people have been held to account for the misbehavior towards the women detainees at that point. And if you could give, if there's any knowledge, that's available to you as to whether there has been some kind of process, whether it was a real or simply an apparent process. That would be all of that would be helpful background to us. Perhaps I can go to Imran first, and then come back to you at the end. Imran, do you have any questions for Alia?
Well, only slightly examining further the questions you asked, Crispin. So, Alia, I'm just slightly interested to know, from what you're saying, the reason that your sister, Jane, has had exceptional treatment and the allegations of being a foreign agent and so on, you say is largely down to your family, your brother, for example, and yourselves being vocal and supporting her publicly. Is that really the reason you're putting forward alone?
It's one of the reasons, and maybe not all the reasons, but for example, in Saudi Arabia, Lujain was arrested first in 2014. Back at the time, we tried to solve the problem behind doors, you know, in a very low profile. We were trying to talk to the governor of Riyadh, the director of the prison, the king, etc. Today, and we are giving a response. For example, people, they say, write a letter. People, they say, wait a bit. There will be changes in the future. Just hold on. Today, before we went public or vocal, we contacted many Saudi authorities, and no one answered us, especially that my parents and the whole family is under travel ban, and we do not know why they are on travel ban. And they asked who ordered this travel ban. Normally in Saudi Arabia, it's e-government, so if you have anything, you know who issued the travel ban, why, what you need to do in order to lift this travel ban. And in my parents' case and my family case, no one can explain who ordered the travel ban, why, what they shall do in order to remove this travel ban. So you see that, yeah, I mean, there are things that we cannot understand. So starting from the point that we do not get any answers to our questions, and on top of that, the main point that pushed us to be very vocal when we learned that Lujain was tortured. And she started speaking up about November 2018. So it was a month after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. You see, it is a bit interconnected. So it gives us, we were very scared. Little by little, we stop being scared and try to show that we have rights to speak, and we have rights to defend our sister, especially that till that time there was no trial. And yeah, I mean, we start to be vocal once we saw that all doors are closed. No one is answering us, and Saudi government is only replying to Bloomberg, CNN, etc. So we say, okay, I mean, we will address the question to them.
Okay. Well,
now, I understand that must be a very frustrating and concerning situation. But one further final question. You, on the position of the royal court from the government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, what benefit do you feel that they feel they're doing in holding your sister and keeping her? You know, from my dispassionate position observing, I can't see a benefit for them. So what would you say the benefit is that makes them take this course of action in regards to Lujain?
Unfortunately, they are not benefiting at all, and it is a big mistake they are making. And it is out of, they are stubborn, I think. So it's just saying that we didn't concede to international pressure or public pressure. So I would say that it is in the benefit of everyone that Lujain is released. And in the Guardian interview with the ambassador of Saudi Arabia to London, he also explained that it is an issue for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Saudi Arabia. So they already admitting that it is a big issue, and I think it's I think there are people, they are taking decisions that not for the good of the country, unfortunately.
Okay, Leila, any questions for Alia?
Yeah, just a quick one. I think, well, thank you so much, Alia. I found your words very moving, and it's making me think a lot about Lujane's mental health and her well-being, and I wondered if you could explain to us the effect that the last 2 years has had, as best to your knowledge as you can, on her and her mental state, but also on your wider family, because I think it's important for our panel to appreciate and broadcast the effect of this regime's decisions on not just those who are being detained, but also on their closest friends and loved ones.
Thank you for the question. It is a very hard question because it impacts everyone and not only Lujane. So I start by the end. For the family, my family, thankfully, they are very strong. They are doing well. However, we are not talking about our weakness together. So, for example, I myself went to, I had some health issues related to the stress, to not being able to sleep correctly, etc. So I went to some kind of not serious but very alarming health issues, and I didn't communicate it to my parents in order to protect them, and they maybe they have some things they didn't communicate it to me, but at the end I explained them my situation, and now it's thankfully I'm doing good. For Lujane, it is very I mean, what she went through, it impacts her her health, mental health also. So, for example, she sometimes not during the visit, but at the beginning, just 1 or 2 months after the torture, she screams in the middle of the night. When she sees my parents, she shakes, and I mean, she was shaking because she was electrocuted. But after the torture, she was. If my parents ask her about her health after knowing that she was tortured, she has some reactions. I mean, we can see that she was really abused, and it makes me very. It makes us all sick to think about it. So we try not to think about it in order to protect ourselves, to stay strong. And for the health conditions, there is a hospital at the prison. So prisoners, they can go to the hospital if they ask and if they insist enough to go, or the doctor visit them. And here it is a really very strange situation, because when she's feeling, I mean, sometimes when she's allowed to see a doctor, the doctors who are working there, they do not speak Arabic. And Lujane is not allowed to speak to them in other language than Arabic. Even she speaks English or French. So they ask her only to speak to the doctor in Arabic. She speaks English, but she's not allowed to speak English. The doctor is not understanding Arabic, so it is with signs in order to explain her situation. And it is just for the record saying, yes, check, she visited a doctor, the doctor saw her, and so it is just kind of formality. So you see, they are getting a bit smarter. They are doing the thing according to the laws. There are laws in Saudi Arabia, but unfortunately they are not respected. Even there are bad laws, but some of anything related to prison conditions, they are not respected at all. So,
Alia, I'm so sorry, but we've got so many people who want to give us evidence. We've overrun quite a bit now, and I want to thank you particularly for the evidence you've given us. If there is, particularly in respect of detention conditions, I would remain interested as chairman of the panel that looks at the conditions of your sister. I'm quite sure Leila will as well. that anything there would be very helpful, because we are looking as a detention review panel. We're looking very carefully at the conditions under which people are being detained and whether they are receiving their legal rights in detention. It's quite a narrow focus. Plainly, the wider situation in Saudi Arabia is the context in which this happens, but that's not what we're inquiring into. And we've very deliberately kept our terms of reference very narrow, and they're very narrow in respect of the two princes that we're investigating here. But by focusing on these high-profile cases, we would hope that that would then have an effect throughout the whole Saudi justice system. And of course, it's the work of people like you and your brother supporting Lujain and other people who appear to have been detained for political reasons that sustains attention on them. And you're doing a very great service, not just for your sister, but for obviously many others, by standing by her and trying to make clear that there are rights to which she is entitled, both under international and indeed under Saudi law. So, Alia, thank you very, very much indeed for your testimony. Very sad. I'd love to go on talking to you for much longer, but we now, I'm afraid, have to move on to our other witness. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, and have a nice session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And now going to move on to Safa Al-Ahmed. Safa, I've only got a short time for you, so if you can give an opening statement, and then hopefully we'll come back to the issues you raised in the wider question session when we're finished with the two witnesses who will follow you.
Thank you. Rather than reading my prepared remarks, I would rather follow up on some of the issues that have come up so far. And most glaringly for me is your questioning of Alia. Clearly shows to me the Saudi PR machine has succeeded in reaching everyone in the kind of focus of, for example, on the conditional release of the human rights activist and some other men. Frankly, to consider that a better condition for them when they're just left from one small prison to a larger prison, and specifically in the case, for example, of Aziza Al-Yusuf, she was released, and soon afterwards her son was arrested. And so basically to us it seems like they are playing a PR game where they are temporarily conditionally releasing these women. All their trials are still ongoing. They're still under very, very close scrutiny and surveillance. They've had trouble going back into their normal lives. Yet for the Saudi government, that is considered a coup, because a lot of pressure was relieved from them because of these temporary releases. And they continue to pretend like the women who are still in jail and the men who are still in jail, they have these ironclad evidence against them. For example, the espionage issue, when they didn't even dare to put it actually in Lujain's accusations. And so I think, unfortunately, the government rhetoric has succeeded with a lot of people in making them seem like, when you're asking us, like, what benefit do they have for keeping somebody like Lujain at such a high cost? But I would ask you, what is the benefit of killing a journalist inside a consulate, dismembering and disappearing him, and then having the most disgraceful court session that yet to this day they haven't even named the people that they have sentenced? And so to me, it's not really a matter of what benefit does that have for them, and they must have a good reason for this. I think the reason is that this is more of a signal to the Saudi people themselves that you better not speak out against the government. You better not dare to organize. You better not dare even think that you have a say in what's happening in your country and to the laws and regulations in the society that you live in. And these are clear messages that have been sent. I mean, what they were hoping to do with the murder of Jamal is also frighten people like us, Saudis in exile, into silence. What happened is the opposite, that we are now more vocal than ever before. We're more organized than ever before. And so when it comes to what is the situation in Saudi Arabia, the focus, for example, of this panel on the two princes, as Adam said, is actually ironic, because now we are in a position as human rights organizations, for example, to defend the people who were the perpetuators for many years. And in the case of Muhammed bin Nayef, he was the deputy to the Minister of Interior, who was his father, who was the Minister of Interior since '79. And so it is an inherited position. And so this is a very, very odd position for us to be to be needing to defend those people that have been actively attacking us. But the reality is, this is a situation in Saudi Arabia right now where nobody is immune to the oppression and to the disappearance and to torture in either official or unofficial prisons. And we've covered that, and I will submit my paper talking in more detail about the conditions of these secret prisons specifically. And I had spoken before about Salman Adwesh, who was close to Muhammed bin Nayef, who was disappeared by then Deputy Crown Prince in one of his own palaces. And so they've gone beyond just having secret locations in hotels and stuff like we've heard with Lujain and the other human rights activists, but they're doing it in their actual palaces, in their basements. So then they have closer control and monitoring. And these things are run by people like Saud al-Qahtani and Maher al-Mutrab. And so to me, I think we need to widen this most definitely than these prisons themselves, because the conditions are scary for everyone right now. Nobody is immune to this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Safa, for the questions. But you will understand, and one of the challenges we face is getting people to speak publicly to explain the position of Saudi Arabia from the view of the government of Saudi Arabia. Now, there may well be reasons. There may well be obvious reasons for why their public diplomacy is conducted in the way that it is, and that part of the evidence that you're giving us will enable us to help come to conclusions around that.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but obviously you've invited the Saudi government to come speak here and defend themselves, and yet these questions it's something that a Saudi government spokesperson would ask. This is if they don't even deign to come here to defend themselves.
Well, no,
there's no reason to ask questions
you will have to judge whether or not the work that the previous panels I've chaired have been fair and rigorous, and whether this one will be fair and rigorous once we've assembled all the evidence and considered, and that's our purpose. It is not the terms of reference are quite narrow. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is an immensely controversial country, and the conduct of
human rights
the laws within there and the cases we are investigating help illustrate and bring international attention to what is happening there, as did the results of our previous inquiry, and that's obviously what it's designed to do. So if there are questions where witnesses are cross-examined, I hope you will understand the context in which those questions are very properly put, so we can come to conclusions that carry a proper credibility, because we have tried to examine this in the widest possible context. Leila, do you have any questions for Safa before you need to leave? We are under.
I need to leave so imminently that sadly not, but I do thank her for the work that she's doing. I share her passion, but we absolutely want to make sure that what we're doing is incredibly rigorous. I mean, if you can answer it very quickly, if we did have the ability to, put ourselves in their shoes and try and imagine what they're trying to do. I mean, there are some who suggest that they are fixing all of these problems, but they're doing it in their way behind closed doors. We just need to let them sort of get on with it.
I think that's nonsense. That's my quick question. It's nonsense.
To that be?
Yeah. My answer is it's nonsense. It's they're lying to you, and they've been lying to you for a really long time. And Jamal's case is quite symbolic of all the other so-called reforms in Saudi Arabia. They are just doing it to cover up their own mistakes. They're a dictatorship, basically, and they have no intention of improving unless there is actually real pressure and intent, and there isn't so far. The G20 happening in Saudi Arabia this weekend is proof that they think they've gotten away with it. They're immune to any real international pressure. All the leaders are going. Pompeo is personally going. What does that tell you?
That administration is about to come to an end.
Yes.
We'll see what happens. Right. Now let's move on to Ines Osman of the MENA Rights Group. And you sent us evidence, and look forward to you speaking to it.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me today. So I wanted today to raise the cases of 2 other members of the royal family, and then I will say a few words about the legal framework that has been enabling this practice of arbitrary detention in Saudi. So first, wanted to talk about the cases of Prince Salman bin Abdu-Aziz bin Salman Al Saud, who is the cousin of MBS, and his father, Mr. Abdu-Aziz bin Salman bin Muhammed Al Saud. So on 4 January 2018, Prince Salman was asked to report to the Saudi royal palace, where a group of other members of the royal family had gathered to inquire about the reasons behind the arrest of another royal. So after arriving at the palace at 4 a.m., Prince Salman and the other members of the royal family present were beaten up by a group of 20 guards under the orders and in the presence of Saud al-Qahtani, who, as you know, is a close advisor to the Crown Prince. So Prince Salman was then arrested alongside 10 others, and due to his injuries from the physical beatings, he had to be transferred to a hospital that was actually located within the Ritz Carlton hotel in Riyadh and remained there for 2 weeks. The next day, on 5 January, around 50 officers who were masked and heavily armed raided the house of the father of Prince Salman, broke all security cameras, and then proceeded to arrest him. He was then transferred to Al-Hayr prison in Riyadh, and his son, Prince Salman, was also transferred to the prison after his 2 weeks at the hospital. For 7 months, they were both detained incommunicado with no contact with the outside world, and though their family attempted to locate them, the authorities were systematically denying holding them. In total, they were in Al-Hayr for a year. Both were held in solitary confinement. And in mid-January 2019, so nearly a year ago, Prince Salman and his father were transferred to a villa in Riyadh, where they were placed under house arrest under high security surveillance. Just noting that the villa is property of the Saudi authorities, and is constantly guarded by at least 10 members of the National Guard, Saudi Police, and Royal Guard. On 27 March 2020, Prince Salman was suddenly taken from the villa and transferred to an unknown location for 2 months, after which he was returned back to the same villa, and still today it's unknown where he was taken and for what reasons. So after the arrest of father and son, and most recently in late September 2020, a member of the European Parliament actually sent letters to the Saudi authorities expressing concern over the arrest and detention of these 2 royals, and the chair of the European Parliament Subcommittee on Human Rights also sent a letter to the Crown Prince, Muhammed bin Salman, expressing concern over the conditions surrounding the detention and asking for their release. But today, there's been no response, and all these diplomatic efforts have yielded no result. So today, nearly 3 years after the arrest, they remain held in that villa, and no charges have ever been brought against them. They were also never interrogated by a law enforcement authority about any criminal offense. So as such, you can fairly say that their detention is deprived of any legal basis, and the fact that to this day, we literally do not know why they're being held. The fact that they're being held in an unofficial detention facility, property of the authorities, is also indicative of the climate of arbitrariness prevailing in the country. We have submitted his case to the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and the case is currently pending. I also wanted to say a few words on the legal framework, but I'll be brief because Abdullah from Dawn already mentioned that. But I just want to highlight that all these violations and the cases that have been raised so far, as well as many others, do not happen in a vacuum, and the legal system in place allows to a great extent for these violations to take place. And in that regard, I wanted to highlight that the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has recently stated that arbitrary detention in Saudi Arabia was practiced in a widespread and systematic manner, and that it could therefore amount to a crime against humanity. So, as has been mentioned before, arbitrary detention in the country can take many forms. It can be prolonged secret detention. We've seen, for example, the case of Abdurrahman al-Sadan, who has been secretly detained since March 2018. His family hasn't heard from him since. Only once he was allowed to make a 1-minute phone call to his loved ones, but he has so far been held in secret detention and hasn't been heard from. And the Saudi authorities have been contacted by the UN, the UN requested the authorities to say, where is he? And he needs to be allowed access to his family, but the Saudis have so far not responded. So detention can also be, as was mentioned, prolonged detention without charge, prolonged pretrial detention, but also detention following grossly unfair trials, because the judiciary in Saudi lacks independence, and a high number of individuals are being prosecuted before the Specialized Criminal Court, which is an exceptional jurisdiction that does not abide by fair trial standards and also admits confessions extracted under torture as evidence. So back to the legal framework, as Abdullah mentioned, there is no penal code in Saudi, and that clearly undermines the principle of legal certainty and pretty much renders prosecution arbitrary, as prosecutors can qualify crimes on a discretionary basis. There is also a number of very broad and vague legislations that are relied upon to prosecute people. We mentioned before the cybercrime law, but also the Counterterrorism Law, which was promulgated in 2014, then amended in 2017. And the law contains an extremely vague definition of terrorism. And we have to keep in mind that it does not even consider the use of violence as a sine qua non element to characterize an act as terrorism. And as a result, a number of individuals who merely exercise their right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, but also freedom of thought, conscience, religion, have been prosecuted on the basis of the anti-terrorism law before an exceptional jurisdiction. So just overall, like, this lack of legal certainty is conducive to the practice of arbitrary detention, and ultimately the range of crimes you can be accused of is so wide that virtually anyone can be prosecuted on whatever basis. So all in all, there are serious flaws in the Saudi legal framework, but my point is that ultimately, if we want to address the case of political prisoners and people who are arbitrarily detained in Saudi, we also need to address the systemic causes behind them, because ultimately these cases are not new. The crackdown has increased since Muhammed bin Salman's ascension to power, but there were cases of other prisoners, political prisoners before. And so we also need to have deep legal and policy reforms for the situation to really improve.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. So we'll I know that come back to second questions. But what I ought to point out at this stage is that it's not just the three politicians who make up this team, is that we're supported by some distinguished lawyers, including Tim Montgomery and Heidi Dickstal. And it is the relationship between international law and the law of Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia has signed international treaties, which ought to establish standards which would then be executed under Saudi law within Saudi Arabia around the conditions of detention and management of alleged offenders. So that is all part of our inquiry, and your evidence and the written evidence we're receiving on that will, of course, receive the proper attention as it draws our attention to the law which Saudi Arabia has placed itself under in the treaties to which it is party, and that then have domestic effect, and also the other treaties as well. So this is the law as well as the politics is an important area of our inquiry, and I thank you very much for the assistance you've given us so far. Our final witness before we go to open questions is Bethany Al-Hadiri of the Freedom Initiative. Bethany.
Thank you. And thank you for organizing this important event, and especially to my colleagues who are working on Saudi Arabia and the human rights organizations represented today. I'm grateful for your work and immense dedication to justice. I'd also like, most importantly, to take a moment to acknowledge the immense and unwavering bravery of every individual who has a family member, a loved one, or who has themselves been victim or a detainee of the Saudi regime that has brought us here today and chosen to speak their truth and tell their stories. And to those who speak out and relive their trauma and that injustice, they're risking their lives and the lives of their loved ones to tell their stories. So they are the reason we're here today. And with their bravery in combination with policymakers, lawyers, human rights organizations, I'm hoping we can turn this into action. And I believe that it is our responsibility to ensure that everyone is telling these stories for a reason. One, so they'll obtain justice, but also that these egregious and shocking violations of basic human rights will not happen to others, and that we'll find accountability and justice here. So thank you for organizing this. As you've heard and will be submitted in further detail, we're speaking about what happens behind closed doors, essentially, namely in prisons. Reports of torture, activists being hung upside down, beaten, toes and limbs being intentionally broken, medical neglect, rape in detention, and murder. We've even received reports of minors in juvenile detention who have been raped to death, and reports of moderate clerics being even sodomized to death in prison. These are despicable patterns of violence in detention that continue and are increasing at present. As Safa has rightfully highlighted, until now, despite these countless violations, Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi authorities have not yet been held accountable for these atrocities. In fact, MBS had the audacity days ago to issue a statement claiming that human rights and freedom of expression were contributing to extremism in the kingdom. In speaking of actual extremism, I would like to raise the case of Dr. Saad al-Jabri, and more will be submitted on his case in writing, but Dr. al-Jabri is the former head of intelligence in the kingdom who was working alongside Muhammad bin Nayef. Him and his family have been targets of this MBS's extremism since the coup to consolidate power. Dr. al-Jabri has been the victim of a life-threatening manhunt and an attempted extrajudicial assassination, which continues to be a threat at present. And while his children, Sarah and Omar, were victims of unlawful travel bans, kidnapping, and enforced disappearance. The countless violations against the family include manipulating filings within the International Criminal Police Organization, or Interpol, for political purposes, and utilizing individuals to act as undeclared intelligence agents to hunt down family members and get information on their family. There's overwhelming evidence that Mohammed bin Salman sent a hit team to extrajudicially assassinate Dr. al-Jabri in 2018, less than 2 weeks after the brutal murder of the Washington Post journalist Jamal, whose case has been raised here. And his innocent children, Dr. al-Jabri's children, were forcibly isolated from their family members, issued travel bans in 2017. And this is despite committing no crimes. And Sarah al-Jabri was only 17 years old, a child at the time that they were issued travel bans. They're being used as a tool. And in March of this year, both Omar and Sarah were forcibly disappeared, and the family has not heard from them since. Neither have committed or been charged with any form of a crime. Another case is of Dr. Walid al-Fatahi. He's a Harvard-trained dual US and Saudi citizen and a motivational speaker who was arbitrarily detained in November of 2017 and held for 21 months without charge or trial. The New York Times did highlight some of the torture that was reportedly used against him, including beatings and electronic shocks. Again, a part of a pattern of what happens within detention to people who've not been charged with anything, and for people simply speaking out. In August of 2019, politicized charges were brought against Dr. Fatahi, citing his tweets, holding dual citizenship, and other ridiculous charges. He was released from prison pending charges the same month, but upon his release, in stark violation of international treaties which protect the rights of individuals to return to their home countries, he was reimposed with a travel ban, and 8 of his family members, who are also US citizens, were as well. They suspended his services and assets in Saudi Arabia, and this rendered him even unable to pay millions of dollars in taxes owed to the United States Internal Revenue Services, despite his multiple attempts to lawfully pay and transfer those funds. He's one of several hundreds who have been detained under the guise of a corruption crackdown ordered by the Crown Prince and silencing rights activists. And sources we know overwhelmingly cite the motivation for these detentions to silence political dissent amongst powerful and influential members of Saudi society. But this also includes the crackdown against women's rights activists, influential clerics, and even US citizens like Saleh al-Haidar, the son of Aziz al-Yusuf, who's been in prison and held without charge since April of 2019, along with the 12 others and another US citizen, Badr al-Ibrahim. And this is also reflected in the case of Abdu-Rahman al-Sadhan, who's already been raised here, a humanitarian aid worker who was kidnapped from his place of work and has only had a 1-minute phone call in his nearly 3 years of detention. So we cannot ignore the growing reports of these egregious violations of human rights in detention in Saudi Arabia, nor can we ignore the dangerous recurring themes of due process violations and political repression within Saudi courtrooms themselves. I believe the global community has a moral obligation to protect every individual in Saudi Arabia, particularly when it involves repressions of freedom and violent repression, even murder in detention. So I, again, appreciate you organizing this event. We'll submit more on these cases, and we ask that immediate action would be taken so that everybody can find justice for these victims in Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We're now going to our Q&A session. And perhaps I'll turn to my colleague, Imran Ahmed Khan, to ask any questions he has of the witnesses. And then I will happily throw it over to those of us, to the participants who have joined us, and do my level best to manage this.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for the evidence they've given. It's been very helpful and said with great passion and emotion. I want to ask a question first of all to Adam, Mr. Kugel, in regards to the evidence submitted by Human Rights Watch earlier. You mentioned there that the authorities generally did not investigate allegations of torture, and these were, and those said, and I quote, were given under torture and ill treatment. I just wanted to request whether you could expand on the evidence base of that assertion. It's very interesting.
So that allegation was related to the research we've done into a lot of the trials, particularly actually involving Eastern Saudi Shia in the Eastern Province, who have been heavily targeted for their political activity in recent years. And what we saw was basically for victims that we were able to speak with directly, as well as just reading the court documents, that many made allegations that they were brutally tortured in detention with a view towards forcing them to sign a confession that was written by their interrogators. And it was almost uniformly the case that people made these allegations either themselves directly to us or through their family members. We, in previous years, had written to the Saudi Human Rights Commission and others urging them to investigate these kinds of allegations. We also, under international human rights law, believe that in the court sessions themselves, once the judges heard these allegations, they had an obligation to investigate them and to ensure that the confessions being presented and being solely relied upon to produce convictions were actually obtained legally and not through coercion or force. And in no case did they do that. And in fact, in most cases, judges ruled that for certain types of legal cases under Islamic law, you cannot retract a confession, or you can't go back on it, and that's the end of the story. So basically, that was the basis of that statement. Beyond that, I do want to say, in terms of the allegations made by women's rights activists, I think the Saudi authorities did make a big deal of saying that the Saudi Human Rights Commission and the Attorney General did research those allegations. And that they came back and found that they were unfounded or something like that. And I think this just goes to the credibility of the investigations, even when they happen, because we had heard separately, sort of leaked information whereby the Human Rights Commission members would meet with the women and actually tell them, we can't actually help you. There's not really much we can do, but we're talking to you now. So, the fact that that same team would then say that they credibly investigated the allegations and found them to be unfounded is really, it's impossible to believe that. So that's the issue is lack of investigations, and when the investigations do happen, lacking any and all transparency. Of course, when they announced the results, I should also add, when they announced the results of those investigations, they didn't give any detail whatsoever. They just said it sort of in a sentence. So that's, I hope that answers your question.
Adam, can I ask you what kind of debate are you able to identify at the top level in Saudi Arabia about how to manage these issues? Because it was the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was admitted as a disaster by the Saudi foreign minister fairly shortly afterwards. It obviously plainly was a total catastrophe for the reputation and image of Saudi Arabia. But the point has been made that it was part of a conduct of justice policy towards the opponents of the regime. Is there a discussion going on inside that you're able in any way to follow, which might suggest that there are doves and hawks at work within the Saudi administration, with some people pointing out that the spectacular failures that have appeared and have drawn the attention of the international community would appear to be serving Saudi Arabia very poorly. And how is that discussion conducted? Is there a discussion of that kind that you're able to identify at the higher levels of the Saudi government?
Is that for me, Mr. Blunt?
Yes, that's for you. And indeed anyone else. Actually, it's a general question about the effect of the work that we're trying to do here. It's obviously all part of it to draw attention to these, to the cases people have heard of and are easy to identify the people because they've got some kind of traction outside of Saudi Arabia. But as an element of which, in the same way as I was anxious for the Ministry of Justice in the United Kingdom to help improve the Saudi justice system, and happily cooperated with that, a later justice minister cancelled that program. But I believe that the work that we're engaged in and everything else ought, in a general way, to have identify where things have gone wrong, where international law is not applied, where standards have not been held, and all of that, little by little, builds up pressure, one would hope, to reinforce the hands of those people saying, if we don't do things properly, it will count against the kingdom. And that will be a growing environment, and it becomes more difficult for countries to do business with Saudi Arabia. Any sign that that conversation is being held at the senior levels of the administration?
So in terms of senior level conversations, that's always been really difficult to ascertain in Saudi Arabia, what the specifics of that or those conversations might be. So I can't speak with any authority as to what the debates are within the Saudi leadership right now. I can say both things we hear from diplomats and some of the stuff that comes out from Saudi mouthpieces on social media would seem to indicate there may be at least some debate within the inner circle about how to proceed on these issues. But we can only really judge based on the actions the government is taking, and those actions would indicate that they are dead set in moving ahead with the repression, and that they think they can get away with it by generating positive PR through some of the women's rights reforms they've announced, or these big legitimacy-seeking public events like the G20, or sporting events, sports washing, and these other things. So I think the issue is those debates may be happening. There's some indication they are happening. However, you know, it appears based on their actions that the authorities think that they can continue to move and get out of this hole that they've dug themselves if they continue to throw money at these sort of legitimacy-seeking activities, which we've identified. And so I think, you know, that's where we need to kind of focus our energy, is to make sure that we continue to remind, you know, people and you know, both within the media as well as decision makers, that, you know, these issues are still important, and that we can't forget about, you know, people who have experienced these horrible abuses.
With any of the rest,
my Saudi colleagues actually may know more about this than I do.
So which is was going to pass on to them now to invite you to make comments then about the political background and the policy background to how the conduct of Saudi justice policy in its widest sense, because I don't think anyone would regard it in an independent way from the outside as an unqualified success for Saudi Arabia. It's been quite the reverse. It's been an utter disaster for the reputation and the interests of Saudi Arabia, in my judgment. And the fact that this panel exists is an indication that it is not, in that sense, this policy does not appear to be working for Saudi Arabia. And so identifying, it was interested in, particularly for our Saudi colleagues, and Safa, I can see your have unmuted, so over to you.
Yeah, I would argue that the question of is there a debate or not irrelevant to this panel and to us, frankly, because the decision maker is one. It is a monarchy. There's only one person that can make the final decisions about anything. This facade of institutions doesn't really exist. The decision has to come from the top. So us talking about the discussions and different people have different issues with what's going on inside Saudi Arabia is irrelevant. As the Guardian article showed, that this discussion within the Foreign Office, the Foreign Ministry, was completely shut down immediately afterwards. And so it is extremely clear to us that they have no intention of improving in any deep, meaningful way, structural way in the country, right? And so we have to, if you're talking about tweaking a few laws, it doesn't mean anything. And I would go back to the conditional release of the woman. This is the scary thing for us, right? So they could technically release Lujain today, right? Immediately after the session, they could release her. There's nothing to stop the government from rearresting her tomorrow, because there's nothing that would structurally have changed that would mean that the same abilities and forces that put her in jail couldn't put her back. And so they're playing a cat and mouse game of like seeing what can they do that would have the minimum impact on their power with the maximum PR impact for them at the same time, right? And so I would ask you to be quite critical of all the moves that the Saudi government makes, especially this week. They've been floating a whole bunch of things before the G20. But in reality, until they have structurally changed the laws in Saudi Arabia and the balances of power in the country, there's all of this is nonsense. There's something that needs to be deeper than have they trained the police properly. I mean, we're talking about rampant torture and beatings inside the prisons. It doesn't matter how much you train them, but if you are telling everyone that they have absolute impunity in how they're treating prisoners, it doesn't matter what you've trained them and how many countries and courses they've taken. Abdullah, I'm sure you have more to say on this than I do.
No, absolutely. I just want to extend on what my co-panelists also touched upon, which is the idea that the Saudi government structurally enable abuse of powers, enable human rights violations. And we're talking here not about just the pretrial detention, but also prosecution, the legal processing, proceedings, the court of law, and I'll just give a quick example of the specialized criminal court, which is supposed to try the cases of national security and terrorism, which try now literally hundreds of people, most of them just based on their peaceful protests, peaceful activism, being part of a peaceful group, or just speaking out on Twitter. And this is just a quick example, and the other example is the Saudi, the governmental actually Human Rights Commission. Human Rights Commission. One of the members of the Human Rights Commission is actually Ahmed al-Muallimi, who is now just appointed as the ambassador to Norway. 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago, she was presented as a symbol for empowering the Saudi government, empowering women, and she's the second female ambassador. So they gave this general and PR about like empowering and all that, and just to know what our Muallimi did is, you can ask Al-Hudlul's family. She visited Lujain al-Hudlul in prison as part of the Human Rights Commission. She heard from Al-Hudlul herself about the electrocution, about torture, about sexual harassment in jail, about how Saud al-Qahtani, the consultant to the Crown Prince, how he threatened to rape her, to sexually harass her, how she was touched, physically touched and harassed in jail, and nevertheless, after she left, after Ahmed al-Muallimi left, hearing all these atrocities and stories, they issued a report about the how prisons are like 5-star hotels. They talked to the West and to the media about that, saying that allegations of torture are baseless. So this is just a quick example of this irony of empowering women and also jailing and sexually harassing, electrocuting women in jail.
I've now got a question from Hayley Dixdale. Hayley, over to you. For Adam.
Yes, that's correct. So my question, Adam, and then anyone else who might want to jump in and answer this as well, it has to do with responsibility for the abuse and human rights violations that were described in detention, and particularly the level of responsibility, whether it goes all the way to the top to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And I'm looking to the report to the Human Rights Council from the UN Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial and Summary and Arbitrary Executions that was submitted in June 2019. And that report had indicated reasonable grounds to believe that individuals who are very close to Mohammed bin Salman were responsible. So from your investigations and research, what evidence have you found about responsibility that goes to the top and connected to the Crown Prince?
So from what I've seen, a lot of this is focused around the person of Saud al-Qahtani, who was a senior advisor to Mohammed bin Salman and was the head of the Royal Court's sort of media shop. And basically, he's alleged frankly, directly by Lujain, and Alia, her sister, who was just on the panel previously, wrote about this very openly in the New York Times, so I can say it here. Basically alleged that Qahtani was in the room and was directly making threats against her and some of the other women. We heard this allegation separately from another women's rights activist, so I certainly believe there's definitely credibility to it. And the fact that he was such a senior advisor and working as MBS's chief enforcer, cracking down on dissent in the country, gives us a real indication that either MBS ordered it and was directly involved, or said, do what you want and I'm going to turn a blind eye. Either way, it's not good for the senior leadership. And I think that that's what Ms. Calamard was getting at in her report. The idea that someone so senior as Saud al-Qahtani would just kind of randomly be going around and harassing people and murdering journalists in Istanbul without some sort of official cover seems unlikely. And we can also say, you know, before he was kicked off Twitter, he himself said very directly, and I can, you know, share the link to the, or at least a screenshot to the tweet, where he said, you know, I don't do anything outside the orders of, you know, the king and the crown prince. So, you know, all of that, you know, we can't, you know, I don't know if we can say with certainty, you know, whether this is a smoking gun or not, but certainly, you know, it indicates that there's a lot more room for inquiry on this question. And there are significant reasons why we think there should be additional scrutiny, and that there very well may be a role by the most senior officials, including Mohammed bin Salman.
Any follow-up questions on that? And if not, I'm now going to turn to ask Imran whether he has any further follow-up questions. And
my only follow-up would be if there's anyone else who has presented today that might have similar examples of evidence from your own work of the degree to responsibility for these abuses.
It's who do I want to pick that up?
Yeah, I think I can. Al-Qist has documented many cases, and Dawn on our own also documented many cases. Human Rights also did, and many other organizations as well. The issue here, I can speak, for example, to my own family issue, which is my father, who has been detained since September 2017. They charged him with, they issued 37 charges against him, including corrupting earth and inciting the public against the kingdom, and disagreeing with the Saudis' public policy, and vague charges, and being part of a group, and also like general and vague charges like these. My uncle was also arrested 2 days after my father because he tweeted about my father, and the arrest of my father. 19 members of my family were banned from travel just right after that. I was also harassed abroad. They suspended my passport. They asked, the Saudi embassy here in Washington, D.C. asked me to go back to the kingdom right after they arrested my uncle, because I have been tweeting about all these cases and human rights in Saudi Arabia for some time, even before that. So I think my own family can tell of what the human rights violation are, and I can give evidence to this as well.
Thank you very much. Imran, over to you.
In many ways, being a member of this panel is an invidious position in terms of having no body present from the Saudi Arabian, the kingdom, to represent them. And other than with my fellow panel members, a private conversation we had with Prince Bandar, nothing coming forward. And it's very difficult when people like Ines Osman, in her testimony she gave us, when the European Parliament's Human Rights Committee requested information in regards to the Crown Prince, and answer came there none. We remember that, and if one wants to have a balanced view on things, it makes it really rather difficult. And one has to recall that in Saudi law, of course, when a woman is silent, that is consent. And so here we hear that silence possibly is consent and acceptance. And I would beg for some further views from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for their positions on various things, or for the questions we're asking, because to get evidence when one can't meet those that are detained, visit those centers where people are being held, interrogate the statements that are being put out, it leads to at least a warped or a distorted view because of a poverty of an alternative point of view being provided to us. But I'm very, very thankful of all the testimony of everybody who's come here today. And all I could say again is that I really wish, as a panel member, that the Kingdom and the state authority of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia engaged formally with us, so it would help bring balance and a 360 view to things. And I don't know whether the panel here have any views on what I've just said.
And I think that's referring to the panel of witnesses rather than the panel itself. Yes. So is there anything, let me pose Imran's question in a different way alongside it. Why have we found it so difficult to find academics, independent spokesmen who might be minded to put the position of Saudi Arabia in its wider context, in the kind of way that might be explained in private to members of parliament by the representative of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to the Court of St. James? Why is it, do we think it's found impossible to try and find witnesses who would then want to speak to us in this kind of session to put the position, the context in which the Saudi Arabian government is making the decisions that it is, to get some kind of understanding? I've tried to make it my work in looking at international relations and conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, to try and turn the board round to understand the perspective of the other parties. Why has it been, do you think, it's been so difficult to find people who would explain the perspective of the government of Saudi Arabia? And does anyone want to?
I can quickly speak to that. I mean, I am myself an academic and visiting professor at George Washington University. I'm also a Saudi trained, a Saudi lawyer. Did my bachelor degree in Saudi Arabia. So and was part at one point of the Saudi program of scholarship, people who were sent abroad to study. And the issue here is that when we go to schools and elites, even elite schools, especially elite schools that produce, decision makers sometimes, and prominent lawyers and people who are really influential in the West, you always hear the government narrative in these circles, and I think in the academic circles and even think tanks, because the idea is that the Saudi government has the money, they have the money, they have the power, they send people abroad, and with that they try them all their best to send people who can represent the narrative of the government. But because the program was abroad during King Abdullah, thousands of people were on that program, and because they could not control, they sent people who later disagree with the government, who criticized it, or were part of people who documented human rights cases inside Saudi Arabia. The idea is that the Saudi government created that bubble of narrative that is saying the Saudi government is protecting the world and all people from its own people, because they always push the narrative that the Saudi society is ultra conservative, is backward, the Saudi society is not willing and capable of trying to be advanced or progressive or liberal in any way. And the only way to protect the world and region from destruction and terrorism is to let the Saudi government control its people and use that iron fist and oppression in order to do that and to make the world peaceful. They have been pushing that narrative. But that bubble, I think we burst the bubble when we have Saudi academics abroad like Mudawir Rashid, and we have human rights defenders like Safa Ahmed, we have journalists, we have people who have been working on these cases, Saudi people who proved otherwise, who proved that they are not part of the government narrative. They can be liberal, progressive, they can have all these views, they can speak their minds, they have their own writings and contributions, but at the same time they are way much more progressive than even the Saudi government claims that it is. I don't know if this answered anything, but yeah.
I understood the question differently, that why it's hard to get anybody from the government perspective to speak to you. Is that correct? Just to add on to what Abdullah said, they invested a lot in these kind of academics and people to present their own opinion, right? And we can give you a laundry list of academics who do just that until now. I think what's become really embarrassing for these kind of people now, and especially after Jamal Khashoggi's murder, it's become, the Saudi government has become a liability. It's become increasingly more difficult to defend the Saudi position. Even the Saudis themselves didn't even show up here because it's indefensible what they've done. It is irrefutable evidence now and accumulative evidence over the years. And we haven't even spoken about the Yemen war, for example, and an atrocious human rights record there. And so it's become untenable for them. And it's untenable for all the people that used to be cheerleaders for the Saudi government and Saudi reform. And it's become nearly impossible to do so in a panel where they have other people like me and Abdullah and Ines and Bethany and Adam who will quite clearly, with knowledge, question any of the stuff that they said. For example, when we give the example that some people were held accountable for the torture in prisons. Who are these people? What are their names? For what have they been held responsible? What was actually done in their cases? It's really easy to give these vague examples of justice that the Saudis have gone through. But in reality, they haven't. In reality, there's very little substance to any of the reforms that they've claimed they've done when it comes to human rights record in Saudi. It's just pure gaslighting.
Do these two princes... No, sorry, it's gone.
Sorry, I just wanted to comment briefly on what Imran raised before, as sort of speaking of your dilemma and having to consider the evidence that we NGOs will bring and the lack of response from the Saudis. I don't see a dilemma, to be frank, because at the end of the day, the evidence speaks for itself. And if the Saudis choose not to respond, silence is their response. And I'm sure Abdullah, for example, has provided you with some court documents. If you just read the 37 charges against his father, there is nothing more for the Saudis to comment on. It's a court document. It relies on certain provisions of the law. And it's very clear that they, as Safa said, they have nothing to say because they can't defend themselves. And you can also have a look at some of the responses to some, for example, UN communications. Just look at the responses to the report of Agnès Calamar or other communications. They're saying we abided by the law and we follow this principle in A, B, C, D, Z. And that's it. And I think ultimately the only answer you're going to get, and we're already getting, is the PR stunt. The Human Rights Commission is one example. Last year, they visited Geneva, and I know they met with a bunch of diplomats, basically trying to portray Saudi under a good light and whatnot. And the response is all the PR they're investing and they're throwing at people. And that's the only answer you'll get. And I frankly don't think you'll be getting anything more than that.
Can I just add very, very briefly? It strikes me as relevant that whenever the Saudi officials themselves do address some of these issues, they almost constantly lie about these cases in a way that's easily provably not the case. So for example, they constantly allege that Lujain and the other women activists had links with foreign entities or actors, including the Saudi ambassador to the UK just last week, when if you actually read their court documents, there is nothing about any of those allegations regarding foreign countries there at all, right? I mean, it's very clear they're not charging them with crimes like that. These are purely defamation tactics. So I would just be very wary about public statements. I don't know if they're made to intentionally mislead, or if the people making the comments are just so ill-informed that they don't know.
Thank you very much indeed. And it's we've now arrived at the end of our time. And I first of all want to thank the team who put all this together for enabling this session to happen, and who are supporting our work as a panel and the work of the expert lawyers who are advising us. But of course, most of all, my thanks go to those of you who have been prepared to put testimony to the panel, both in writing and now through this session orally. It is only because people are prepared to make governments accountable that their behaviour will improve, and you are all making a very great contribution in one of the circumstances is the most challenged, important nations in the world. And that's why I accepted the commission to chair this panel, in the hope that the attention that we're able to bring to this, and the authority and the independence of mind that we're able to bring to it, based on the evidence that's submitted to us, can help improve matters as part of that examination of the situation in Saudi Arabia. And you have all enormously helped our work and consideration. And I thank you all very much indeed. And now bring this evidence session to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.